In July 2026, 6,000 drones flew toward Moscow. Not over the course of a year, not over the course of a season. 6,000 unmanned aerial vehicles targeting a single city in a single month. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, Putin's third most powerful man, the technocratic administrator who has run the capital for over a decade with unwavering loyalty, stood before cameras and confessed a number that no Kremlin official has ever been forced to say out loud. 6,000 drones, two-thirds of all Ukrainian aerial attacks on Russian territory, aimed at one city. The front line, Sobyanin admitted, had reached the gates of the Kremlin. Volodymyr Zelensky had predicted exactly this moment. When not 100 drones but 1,000 start reaching Moscow, he said, and when he feels it and sees it, he will be advised to move somewhere beyond the Urals. That prediction is no longer hypothetical. But Sobyanin's confession didn't stop there. In a statement that sent shockwaves through Russian state media and the Kremlin's inner circle, Sobyanin declared that a full transition to a war economy, the very thing Russia's military hawks have been demanding for months, would kill the country. Those are the words of Moscow's mayor, not a Western analyst, not a Ukrainian official, the man who runs Putin's capital, on camera, telling the Russian people that the path the Kremlin is on leads to national death. That moment, that fracture, is the most significant crack in Putin's power structure since the war began. To understand why, you need to understand the deal Putin made. Not the deal with the West, not the deal with Ukraine, the deal with his own people, specifically with the elites, the oligarchs, and the 13 million residents of Moscow who form the political, economic, and psychological center of the Russian state. The deal was simple: absolute security in exchange for silence and political obedience. Moscow would be protected, Moscow would be prosperous, Moscow would be insulated from the consequences of whatever wars the Kremlin chose to fight. The provinces would bleed, the minorities would be conscripted. The Far East, Siberia, the Caucasus, those places would provide the bodies. But Moscow would sip its coffee, shop at its boutiques, and pretend the war was happening on someone else's planet. That deal is now shattered. On an evening in early August at the Balzy Rossi restaurant, one of the most exclusive dining establishments in central Moscow, a place where generals celebrate birthdays and oligarchs close deals, a woman walked toward the entrance carrying what investigators would later determine was an improvised explosive device. She was stopped by security, questioned, and then the bomb detonated, remotely, by someone watching from a distance. The target was the family of General Alexander Chaiko, Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Aerospace Forces, one of the highest-ranking military figures in the country, appointed to that role just months earlier, in May 2026, and a key figure in the command structure built around Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Danil Peradry, Chaiko's son-in-law, was killed instantly. Chaiko's own daughter was reportedly severely injured. A birthday celebration for the family of a man who commands Russia's entire aerial war effort turned into a crime scene in the heart of Moscow. The message was devastating in its clarity. The architects of this war can no longer guarantee the safety of their own families at a private dinner in their own capital. Not in a trench, not on the front line, at a restaurant table holding a glass of wine, surrounded by security, and still not safe. Fox News reported that analysts viewed the bombing as exposing critical security gaps around Putin's military elite. One expert noted that Putin's effort to preserve a sense of normalcy in Moscow had created the vulnerability that Ukraine exploited. The means of the attack, a remotely detonated device delivered by a civilian courier who may not have known what she was carrying, matched the pattern of other targeted assassinations deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine's general staff has characterized this campaign as long-range sanctions, official doctrine for a strategy of deep strikes designed to bring the cost of war directly to those who command it. The Balzi-Rossi bombing was not an isolated event. It was the most spectacular node in a web of security failures that has engulfed Moscow throughout the summer. On the same day, Sobyanin made his drone confession. The Central Research Institute of Machine Building, known as TSNIIMash, Roscosmos's primary research facility for ballistic missile development and space technology, erupted in massive flames. Officials claimed the fire was caused by a short circuit. The timing was either the most unfortunate coincidence in Russian history or something far more deliberate. And then came the panic at Moscow City. The Moscow International Business Center, a cluster of nearly 20 glass skyscrapers housing thousands of elite employees, was hit by emergency sirens, elevators locked, stairwells flooded with terrified workers. Thousands of people poured into the streets in a stampede of genuine panic. It turned out to be a false alarm, but the false alarm revealed something more damaging than any real attack could have: the psychological state of Moscow's population. These are people who, just a few years ago, would have heard a siren and shrugged. Now, within seconds, thousands fled in absolute certainty that Ukrainian drones were about to hit. The trauma is total. The drones that provoked this psychological collapse are hitting the infrastructure Moscow depends on to survive. The Kapotnya oil refinery, owned by Gazprom Neft and meeting nearly half of Moscow's fuel demand, has been struck repeatedly. Lines at gas stations stretched for hours. Armed National Guard units patrolled fuel stations to suppress riots. A black market for gasoline emerged. Quotas of 20 to 30 liters per vehicle were imposed. The capital of a petrostate was rationing gasoline. The logistics collapse followed. Transport trucks couldn't find diesel. Factory shipments to Moscow ground to a halt. The food supply chain buckled. Supermarkets saw inventory shortages and panic buying. Scenes that Moscow residents associated with the Soviet collapse, with everything Putin had promised they would never see again. And then Ukraine hit the Wildberries warehouses. Elektrostal, Podolsk, massive fulfillment centers burning to the ground, an estimated $1.3 billion in damage, with 88,000 small sellers cut off from inventory overnight. Even Margarita Simonyan, editor-in-chief of RT, one of the Kremlin's most loyal propagandists, began posting confessions about how badly Moscow's air defenses are struggling against the swarm attacks. Sobyanin's confession was not bravery. It was the recognition that the lie had become unsustainable. You cannot tell 13 million people that everything is fine when their airports close every night, when armed guards stand at gas stations, when their grocery shelves thin, when a general's family gets bombed at dinner, and when 6,000 drones fly over their heads in a single month. But the rebellion goes deeper than one mayor's confession. Behind closed doors, Moscow is bracing for a new general mobilization. Inside the State Duma, figures like Deputy Andrei Kolesnik have pushed publicly for full war economy measures, the very escalation Sobyanin warned would be catastrophic. Rumors circulate that a broader mobilization wave could come after the September Duma elections, and the economics make Sobyanin's warning impossible to ignore. The central bank's interest rate stands at 14%. GDP growth has flatlined at 0 to 1%, and inflation is burning through household budgets. All of this before a full war economy is even attempted. Russia's military losses are unsustainable. Over 35,000 casualties per month. Unemployment sits at a record low of 2%, not because the economy is thriving, but because every available body has been absorbed. Sobyanin's statement that a war economy would kill the country reads as a warning, perhaps aimed at the hawks in the State Duma, perhaps aimed at Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, whose faction has reportedly pressed for full mobilization, perhaps aimed at Putin himself, that full economic mobilization would mean the end of civilian Russia. Meanwhile, Putin has signed laws that effectively strip dissenting Russians abroad of their citizenship. Property confiscated, bank accounts frozen, access to all state services severed, digital and social death, imposed by executive signature. This is not the behavior of a confident regime. This is a system that knows its legitimacy is hemorrhaging and has decided to replace consent with terror. Nearly the entirety of the budget is being poured into a war that produces no victory. National wealth funds have melted. The budget deficit has reached unsustainable levels. The deeper fracture is geographic. Since the war began, the Kremlin pushed the provinces to the front while keeping Moscow insulated. Ukraine's drone campaign, what Kyiv calls its long-range sanctions doctrine, obliterated that psychological wall. Moscow's airspace is riddled with holes. The privileged Muscovites are personally tasting the terror once reserved for border regions like Belgorod and Kursk. This is the unilateral termination of Putin's social contract, absolute security in exchange for silence. When that contract breaks, the bond doesn't weaken gradually, it snaps. 6,000 drones in 1 month. A general's son-in-law killed at dinner. TSNIIH, Roscosmos's crown jewel, in flames. A fuel crisis enforced by armed guards at Gazprom neft stations. A logistics network burning. A propagandist confessing. A mayor telling the nation the path leads to death. A state Duma faction demanding escalation while Gerasimov's generals lose control of the sky. And laws being signed that erase citizens from existence for the crime of disagreement. The system Putin built over 2 decades cannot bear the weight of this war any longer. The rebellion doesn't look like a coup. It doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like the slow, irreversible withdrawal of faith from a system that promised invincibility and delivered 6,000 drones over Moscow in July. And Zelensky watching, saying he told us so. Was Washington right? Can Putin survive the rebellion from within? Drop your take in the comments. If this breakdown helped you see what's happening behind the Kremlin's walls, hit subscribe. The cracks are widening, and we're tracking every one.